Alright, I'm back with the mandate, part 2. Sorry to make this part 2, actually. I just had shit to do. Um, anyways, personally, I think the stage we're in with Palestine is like the cyber mandate, which might be akin to just a reset, which just is just genocide overall. But with how it is, which I will get to in like 5 videos from now, um, you will see how messed up it is actually becoming. Alright. Around the same time, another secret treaty was negotiated between the United Kingdom and France, with assent by the Russian Empire and Italy to define their mutually agreed spheres of influence and control in an eventual partition of the Ottoman Empire. The primary negotiations leading to the agreement occurred between the 23rd of November 1915 and the 3rd of January 1916. On the 3rd of January, the British and French diplomats Mark Sykes and Francois Georges Picot uh, initialed an agreement memorandum. The agreement was ratified by their respective governments on the 9th and 16th of May 1916. The agreement allocated the British control of present-day southern Israel and Palestine, Jordan, and southern Iraq, and an additional small area, including the ports of Haifa and Acre, to allow access to the Mediterranean. The Palestine region, with smaller boundaries than the later mandatory Palestine, was to fall under an international administration. The agreement was initially based on the basis for the 1918 Anglo-French modus vivendi, which provided a framework for occupied enemy territory administration in the Levant. Commitment to the League of Nations, the Mandate System. The Mandate System was created in the wake of World War I as a consequence, a compromise between Woodrow Wilson's idea of self-determination set out in his 14-point speech in January 1918 and the European powers designed for gains for their empire. It was established under Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, entered into the 28th of June 1919 as a part 1 of the Treaty of Versailles, and came into force on January 10th, 1920 with the rest of the treaty. Article 22nd was written 2 months before the signing of the peace treaty, before it was agreed exactly which communities, peoples, or territories could be covered by the 3 types of mandates set out in subparagraph 4, 5, and 6. Class A, quote, formerly belonged to the Turkish Empire, Class B of Central Africa, and Class C, Southwest Africa, and certain of the South Pacific Islands. The treaty was signed and the peace of conference adjourned before a formal decision was made. 2 governing principles formed the core of the mandate system: non-annexation and the territory and its administration as a secret trust of civilization to develop the territory for the benefits of the native people. The mandate system differed fundamentally from the protectorate system which preceded it, in that the mandatory powers obligations to the inhabitants of the territory were supervised by the third party, the League of Nations. The mandates were to act as legal instruments containing an instrumentally agreed upon term for administering certain post-World War I territories on behalf of the League of Nations. These were of the nature of the treaty and a constitution which contained minority rights clauses that provided the rights for petition and abdication by the World Court. The process of establishing the mandates consisted of 2 phases: the formal removal of sovereignty of the state previously controlling the territory, followed by the transfer of mandatory powers to individual states among the Allied powers. According to the Council of the League of Nations meeting of August 1920, quote, draft mandates adopted by the Allied and associated powers would not be definite until they had been considered and approved by the League. The legal title held by the mandatory power must be double one confronted by the principal powers and the other confronted by the League of Nations. 3 steps were required to establish a mandate. 1. The principal allied and the associated powers confer a mandate on one of their number or on a third power. 2. The principal powers officially notify the Council of the League of Nations that a certain power has been appointed mandatory for such a certain defined territory. And 3. the Council of the League of Nations takes official cognizance of the appointment of the mandatory power and informs the latter that it, quote, the Council, in brackets, quotes, considers it as invested with the mandate and at the same time notifies it of the terms of the mandate after ascertaining whether they are in conformance with the provisions of the covenant. Man, this is sounding kind of weird, honestly. I know this is discussing how the cake of the nation is being sliced up, and it only makes sense that Palestinians maybe had the illusion of more land before they started getting deeper into the situation, and Palestine just started to lose land more and more. But some would argue before the state there was no territory that was owned, so there's this feedback loop of sort of like there was no ownership. So people talk about natives as either they don't have a right or they do have a right, but there's still this lack of ownership that you don't have, while at the same time the people who create the rules can tell you this, but the people at the bottom can't tell you this, but the people at the top obviously made the rules and what the law says that is the standard of what we abide by. So it's a little bit of a hypocrisy going on by saying that, well, they would take over if it weren't for this, so they're no better than what we do when we do war. Just look out for that type of rhetoric, honestly. Okay, that seemed a bit off topic, but that's kind of what that stealing the land through percentage and divvying it up kind of reminded me of. All right. Discussions about the assignment of the region's central began immediately after the war ended and continued at the Paris Peace Conference and February 1920 Conference of London, and the assignment was made up at the April 1920 San Remo Conference. The Allied Supreme Council granted the mandate for Palestine and Mesopotamia to Britain and those for Syria and Lebanon to France. In association of the peace conference, the British devised a Sharafan solution to make straight all the tangle of their various wartime commitments. This proposed that three sons of the Sheriff Hussein, who had since become king of the Hejaz, and his sons Emirs, princes, would be installed as kings of newly created countries across the region, agreed between McMahon and Hussein in 1915. The Hashemite delegation to the Paris Peace Conference, led by Hussein's third son Emir Faisal, had been invited to the British to represent the Arabs at the conference, and they had wanted Palestine to be part of the proposed Arab state, and later modified this request to an Arab state under the British mandate. The delegation made two initial statements to the peace conference. The one, January 1919 memorandum, referred to the goal of uniting the Arabs eventually into one nation, defining the Arab regions as, quote, from a line Alexandria Persia southward to the Indian Ocean, end quote. The 29th of January memorandum stipulated that from the line of Alexandria Dayak Burke southward to the Indian Ocean, with the boundaries of any new states, were, quote, matters for the arrangements between us after the wishes of their respectful inhabitants have been ascertained. Okay, so maybe I'm talking out of my ass here, guys. But as I was lurking, as I already explained before talking about this, although I said some stupid shit on Twitter, but I'm going to go into that later in another video. So, point by point with the shit I said. Anyways, this from the line Alexandria southward to the Indian Ocean, kind of reminds me to the ocean, to the sea, or whatever the hell that people are saying is anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic. So I can't tell you for sure, but that line sort of reminds me of the setup of who goes where, which again could still mean like a dog whistle. I'm not saying that like Free Palestine or whatever couldn't mean something negative. Um, anyways, sorry about that if that was off topic. Where was I? Um, in the reference to Woodrow Wilson's policy of self-determination, in his 6 February 1919 presentation to the Paris Peace Conference, Faisal, speaking on behalf of King Hassan, asked for Arab independence, or at least the right to choose the mandatory. The Hashemites had fought for the British during the war and received an annual subsidy from Britain, according to the confidential appendix to the August 1919 King Crane Commission report. The French resent the payment to the English to the Emir Faisal of the large monthly subsidy, which they claim covers a multitude of bribes, and enables the British to stand off and show clean hands while Arab agents do dirty work in their interest. Well, of course, they will always use people and make it look like the underclass is doing the most when the idea guy who, on average, we will blame the idea guy depending on a circumstance. Like if they're committing murder with their idea, usually we call that out. But when it's like a great idea that saves people, it's like, oh, look how brilliant this person is. Like, I guess it really depends. Okay. But anyways, leaders usually making the underclass do some dirty work while everything is in shambles in the citizen realm. Anyways, the World Zionist Organization delegation to the peace conference, and I believe this is talking about the Christian Zionists that led to Jewish Zionism, since Jewish people and Zionism are separate, actually. Zionist is a creation created by the empires that were installing Israel. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. Led by Chaim Weizmann, who had been the driving force behind the Balfour Declaration and asked for a British mandate asserting the historic title of the Jewish people to Palestine. The confidential appendix of the King Crane Commission noted that the Jewish are distinctly for Britain as mandatory power because of the Balfour Declaration. The Zionists met with Faisal 2 weeks later before the start of the conference in order to resolve this difference. The resulting Faisal-Weizmann agreement was signed on the 3rd of January 1919, together with the later written by T.E. Lawrence in Faisal's name to Felix Frankfurter in March 1919. The agreement was used by the Zionist delegation to argue that their plans for Palestine had prior Arab approval. However, the Zionists omitted the Faisal's handwritten caveat and that the agreement was conditional on Palestine being within the area of Arab independence. The French privately seceded Palestine and Mosul to the British in December 1918 amendment to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The amendment was finalized at a meeting in Deauville in September 1919. Matters were confirmed at the San Remo Conference, which formally assigned the mandate for Palestine to the United Kingdom after Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. Although France required the continuation of its religious protectorate in Palestine, Italy and Great Britain opposed it. France lost the religious protectorate, but thanks to the Holy See, Holy See? Like looking? Okay, sure. Continued to enjoy liturgical honors in mandatory Palestine until 1924, when the honors were abolished. As Weizmann reported to his WZO colleagues in London in May 1920, the boundaries of the mandatory territories were unspecified at San Remo and would be determined by the principal Allied powers at a large stage. Okay. Under the terms of the 1915 McMahon-Hussein Correspondence and the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, Transjordan was intended to become part of the Arab state of the Confederation of Arab States. British forces retreated in spring 1918 from Transjordan after the first and second attacks on the territory. indicating that their political ideas about its future, they had intended the idea to become part of an Arab Syrian state. The British subsequently defeated the Ottoman forces in Transjordan in late September 1918, just a few weeks before the Ottoman Empire's overall surrender. Transjordan was not mentioned during 1920 discussion at San Remo, at which the mandate for Palestine was awarded. Britain and France agreed that the eastern border of Palestine would be the Jordan River as laid out in Sykes-Picot Agreement. That year, two principles emerged from the British government. The first was that the Palestinian government would not extend east of the Jordan. The second was the government's chosen, albeit disputed, in interpretation of the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, which proposed the Transjordan be included in the area of Arab independence, excluding Palestine. Regarding Faisal's Arab Kingdom of Syria, the French removal of Hashim al-Attisi's newly proclaimed nationalist government and expelled King Faisal from Syria after the 23rd of June 1920 Battle of Maysalun. The French formed a new Damascus state after the battle and refrained from extending their rule into the southern part of Faisal's domain. Transjordan became a no man's land, or as Samuel put it, politically derelict. After the French occupation, the British suddenly wanted to know, what is the Syria for which the French received a mandate at San Remo, and does it include Transjordan? Jordania? Okay. British Foreign Minister Lord Curzon ultimately decided that it did not. Transjordan would remain independent, but in a close relationship with Palestine. On August 6, 1920, Curzon wrote to newly appointed High Commissioner Herbert Samuel about Transjordan. Quote, I suggest that you should let it be known forthwith that in the area south of the Sykes-Picot line, we will not admit French authority and that our policy for this area to be independent but in closer relations with Palestine. Samuel replied to Curzon, quote, after the fall of Damascus a fortnight ago, sheiks and tribes east of Jordan, utterly dissatisfied with Sharifian government, had unlikely would accept revival. Okay. Yeah, probably not. And asked to be part of Transjordan directly under his administrative control. 2 weeks later, on the 21st of August, Samuel visited Transjordan without authorization from London. At the meeting with 600 leaders in Salt, he announced the independence of the area from Damascus and its absorption into the Mandate, proposing to quadruple the area under his control by tacit capitulation. Samuel assured his audience that Transjordan would not be merged with Palestine. Curzon was in the process of reducing British military expenditures and was unwilling to commit significant resources to an area considered of marginal strategic value. He immediately repudiated Samuel's actions and sent via the Foreign Office a reiteration of his instructions to minimize the scope of British involvement in the area. Quote, there must be no question of setting up any British administration in that area, end quote. At the end of September 1920, Curzon instructed an assistant secretary at the Foreign Office, Rupert van der Staart, to leave the eastern boundary of Palestine undefined and avoid, quote, any definite connection between Transjordan and Palestine to leave the way open for an Arab government in Transjordan. Curzon subsequently wrote in February 1921, I am very concerned about Transjordania. Sir H. Samuel wants it as an annex of Palestine and an outlet for the Jews. Here I am against him. Abdullah, the brother of recent opposed King Faisal, marched into Man at the head of an army of 300 to 2,000 on the 21st November of 1920. Between then and the end of March 1921, Abdullah's army occupied all of the Transjordan with some local support of no British opposition. The Cairo Conference was convinced, or sorry, the Cairo Conference was convened on the 12th of March, 1921, by Winston Churchill, then British Colonial Secretary, and lasted until the 30th of March. It was intended to endorse an arrangement whereby Transjordan would be added to the Palestinian Mandate, with Abdullah at the Emir under the authority of the High Commissioner, and with the condition that the Jewish national home provisions of the Palestine Mandate would not apply here. On the first day of the conference, the Middle East Department of the Colonial Office set out the situation of Transjordan in a memorandum. On the 21st of March 1921, the Foreign and Colonial Office legal advisors decided to introduce the Article 25th into the Palestinian Mandate to allow for the addition of Transjordan. Okay. All right, drafting. The intended mandatory powers were required to submit written statements to the League of Nations during the Paris Peace Conference, proposing the rules of administration in the mandate areas. Drafting of Palestine Mandate began well before it was formally awarded at San Remo in April 1920, since it was evident that at the time of the war that Britain was the favored power in the region. The mandate had a number of drafts: the February 1919 Zionist proposals to the Peace Conference, a December 1919 compromise draft between the British and the Zionists, a June 1920 draft after Curzon's watering down, and the December 1920 draft submitted to the League of Nations for comment. 1919. Initial Zionist-British discussions. Okay. The February 1919 Zionist proposal to the Peace Conference was not discussed at the time, since Allies' discussions were focused elsewhere. It was not until July 1919 that direct negotiations between the British Foreign Office and the Zionists, after the production of a full draft mandate by the British. The British draft contained 29 articles compared to the Zionist proposal's 5 articles. However, the Zionist Organization report stated that a draft was presented by the Zionist Organization to the British on the 5th July 1919. Balfour authorized Diplomatic Secretary Eric Forbes Adams to begin negotiations with the Zionist organizations. On the Zionist side, the drafting was led by Ben Cohen on behalf of the Wiesman, Felix Frankfurter, and other Zionist leaders. By December 1919, they had negotiated a compromise draft. Curzon negotiations. Although Curzon took over the Balfour October, he did not play an active role in the drafting until mid-March. Israel historian Devorah Barzilai Yegar notes that he was sent a copy of the December draft and commented, "The Arabs are rather forgotten," end quote. When Curzon received the draft of 15 March 1920, he was far more critical and objected to formations that would imply recognition to any legal rights, end quote. For example, that the British government would be responsible for placing Palestine under such political, administration, and economic conditions, as well as secure the establishment of the Jewish national home and the development of self-governing commonwealth, end quote. Curzon insisted on revisions until the 10th of June draft removed his objections. The paragraph recognized the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine was removed from the preamble, and, quote, self-governing commonwealth was replaced by self-governing institutions. The recognitions of the establishment of the Jewish national home as the guiding principle of the executions of the mandate was omitted. After strenuous objections to the proposed changes, the statement concerning the historical connections between the Jews and the Palestinians was reincorporated into the mandate in December 1920. The draft was submitted to the League of Nations on the 7th of December 1920 and was published in the Times on the 3rd of February 1921. All right. 1921, the Transjordan article. All right. I am moving on a little bit after this. All right. The inclusion of Article 25th was approved by Curzon on the 31st of March 1921, and the revised final draft of the mandate was forwarded to the League of Nations on the 22nd of July 1922. The Article 25th permitted the mandatory to, quote, postpone or withhold applications of such provisions of the mandate as he may consider inapplicable to the existing local conditions in that region. The final text of the mandate includes an Article 25th, which states, in the territories lying between the Jordan River and the eastern boundary of Palestine, as ultimately determined, the mandatory shall be entitled, with the consent of the Council of the League of Nations, to postpone or withhold applications of such provisions of this mandate as he may consider inapplicable to the existing local conditions, and to make such provisions for the administration of the territories as he may consider suitable to those conditions. The new article was intended to enable Britain to, quote, to set up an Arab administration and to withhold indefinitely the application of those clauses of the mandate which relate to the establishment of the national home for the Jews, end quote. As explained in the Colonial Office letter 3 days later, this created two administrative areas: Palestine under direct British rule and the autonomous Emirate of Transjordan under the rule of Hashemite family. In accordance with the British government's amendment interpretation of the 1915 Mann-Hussein Correspondence, at discussions in Jerusalem on the 28th of March, Churchill proposed his plan to Abdullah that Transjordan would be accepted into the mandatory area as an Arab country apart from Palestine, and that it would be initially for 6 months under the nominal rule of Umar Abdullah. Churchill said that Transjordan would not form part of the Jewish national home to establish west of the River Jordan. All right. So, as you can see, it does seem initially that it was supposed to, like, incorporate Palestine, but it's just being called the home of the Jews, and it's more and more being associated like that. So, in reality, the two-state solution right now is British props up a home for the Jews, while the other solution is apartheid, for the Palestine, which we will get to in a moment. All right. Transjordania would not be included in the present administrative system of Palestine, and therefore the Zionist clauses of the mandate would not apply. Hebrew would not be made an official language in Transjordania, and the local government would not be expected to adopt any measures to promote Jewish immigration or colonialization. And obviously there's pushback, it seems. Forgot to kind of register that. All right. Abdullah's 6-month trial was extended, and by the following summer he began to voice his impatience at the lack of formal confirmation. So it's probably, like, controversial at this time to talk about this like it was just the Jewish homeland. So that's probably another takeaway from this, is that nobody really knew what they wanted to do here. Like, at the end of the day, the citizens were probably not okay with what the elites were doing to them. So it's really a different reality depending whose perspective you take. All right. The Palestinian Arab attempted involvement. Syrians present grievances at League. Okay. The drafting was carried out in no input from any Arabs, despite the fact that their disagreement with the Balfour Declaration was well known. Palestinians' political opposition began to organize in 1919 to form a Palestinian Arab Congress, which formed by the local Muslim Christian associations. In March 1921, the new British Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill came to the region to form British policy on the ground at the Cairo conference. The leader of the Palestine Congress, Musa al-Husseini, had tried to present the view of the executive committee in Cairo and later Jerusalem, but was rebuffed both times. In the summer of 1921, the Fourth Palestine Arab Congress sent a delegation led by Musa al-Husseini to London to negotiate on behalf of the Muslim and Christian population. On the way, the delegation held meetings with Pope Benedict the 15th and diplomats from the League of Nations and Geneva, where they met Balfour and was non-committal. Sorry. In London, they had 3 meetings with Winston Churchill in which they called for reconsideration of the Balfour Declaration, revocation of the Jewish national home policy, an end to Jewish immigration, and that Palestine should not be severed from its neighbors. All their demands were rejected, although they received encouragement from some conservative members of parliament. Musa al-Husseini led a 1922 delegation to Ankara and then to the Lausanne Conference, where after Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's victories against the Greek army and Turkey and Treaty of Sevres was about to negotiated, the Palestinian delegations hoped that with Ataturk's support, they would be able to get the Balfour Declaration and mandate policy omitted from the new treaty. The delegation met with Turkey's lead negotiator, Ismet Pasha, who promised that, quote, Turkey would insist upon the Arabs' right of self-determination and the Palestinians' delegation should be permitted to address the conference, end quote. However, he avoided further meetings, and other members of the Turkish delegation made clear that intentions to accept the post-World War I status quo. Wait a second. Turkish delegation made clear that intention to accept the post-World War I status quo. Okay. During the negotiations, Ismet Pasha refers to negotiate, recognize, or accept the mandates. Although they were not referenced in the final treaty, it had no impact on implementation of the mandate policy set in motion 3 years earlier. Okay. Final amendments. Each of the principal Allied powers had a hand in drafting the proposed mandate, although some, including the United States, had not declared war on the Ottoman Empire and did not become members of the League of Nations. Alright, so I almost wanted to say they were a part of that, but I'm pretty sure they weren't, because I've yet to read anything about that specifically. Okay. The Zionist Organization draft, signed by Walter Rothschild, the Zionist Organization, okay. Zionist Organization of America, Julian Mack, alright. Hold on, I'm just reading this to myself really quickly. Why is this crossed out like that? Was somebody else editing this and, like, decided not to just edit the text and just cross it out? Like, guys, tell me, what the hell is this? Like, why is that? Like, is this wrong now? Is that what that's trying to say? Okay. I'll see you in the next one, guys.